The end of the year is almost upon us, and for the League of Legends community, that means one exciting thing: Worlds is right around the corner. The League of Legends World Championship can be a sometimes predictable and almost demoralizing experience if all you care about is what region comes out on top, as ever since 2013, either China or Korea has taken every title, with their teams always being favorited beforehand. However, if you look a little more in depth at the individual teams and the players, and don't just focus on the final result of each region, there are always tons of interesting stories to follow. This year, maybe more than ever, we have an incredibly competitive World Championship coming up with tons of stories to follow from each and every region, and today I'm going to be outlining some of my personal favorite storylines that I'll be looking forward to when matches begin. We're going to talk about all of that and a lot more, but first, this video is sponsored by me. I'm the sponsor. Do you like the documentaries I make? Do you want me to make more? Well, if that's the case, consider pledging to our brand new and improved Patreon page over at patreon.com/gbay99. There you'll find all sorts of rewards, like an exclusive podcast that comes out every other week, polls deciding my next videos, Q&As, and maybe best of all, the Patreon messaging system, which is probably the most reliable way to talk to me if you are interested in any specific comments or questions that you want to make sure I read. Now, in the past, I've actually missed the rewards schedule a couple of times. Old patrons might remember that there have been a few moments in the past where I would focus a little bit too much on video production and forget to give out the rewards to patrons for a month or something. That's not going to happen anymore, though, because recently, over the past couple of months, I've been playing so much League of Legends and streaming so frequently that I gave myself carpal tunnel. So I can't really play the game anymore, and I gotta make sure that I can support myself. Medical bills are not cheap in America. Can't afford to miss out on rewards anymore. Jokes aside, though, if you guys are interested in potentially trying to support the channel a bit, please consider looking over at the Patreon page and just scrolling through some of the rewards, see if anything interests you. I really appreciate it more than I can possibly express. But anyway, let's get back into the video. To structure this, we're going to start off by talking about the teams and regions that are least likely to win Worlds, and then lead up to the best organizations out there that have a real shot at making a run for the title happen. And if we're talking about who's bottom of the barrel this year, we have to start off by talking about North America. Now, I'm from NA myself, and I honestly would love for the region to prove me wrong, but this year the LCS has looked incredibly weak, and the three teams coming from the region don't really have too much of a shot of even just making it out of groups, much less winning at all. Still, there is some hope and some positive stories to focus on, which are namely the rookies that NA is sending this year in Tactical and Spica. These two players made their LCS debuts after being pulled up from Academy in 2020, and each are worth paying attention to for different reasons. Starting off with Spica, he of course is the jungler for TSM, and for my money, he might be the most underrated player currently playing in LCS. A lot of TSM fans seem to not like this guy for some reason, but he is one of the most talented players they have on their roster at the moment. If you want a great example of his skill in action, look no further than the losers bracket finals matchup of the 2020 Summer LCS playoff series, where TSM was playing against Team Liquid. Spica was jungling up against Broxah, who was this fancy new import that Team Liquid brought in from Fnatic this year, yet in spite of being this expensive hot commodity, he got out jungled every single game incredibly hard in this best of 5 by Spica, who was already outplaying him in just his first jungle clears alone. In game 1, Spica was on Nidalee going up against Broxah's Lee Sin, who both started out on the bot side buff and jungled up to top side Crab. Spica correctly did a full clear on his side of the jungle, taking everything except for Gromp, which takes advantage of Nidalee's excellent clear time. He then came top side briefly to get vision of Broxah and harass him a little bit, securing priority for topside, who could then guarantee they would get top scuttle. After seeing Broxah at Krugs, Spica was then able to confidently cross map through mid lane to take the second Crab away from Broxah, getting a huge lead on him. He was then able to recall, buy his jungle item, go gank top lane, and get himself a kill, all in the time it took Broxah to just catch back up in CS and then recall himself. In Game 2, it was more of the same, with Spica this time on Olaf going up against Broxah's Hecarim. Here, while Spica was doing his full clear, Broxah decided to only go for a 4-camp clear, which is a little bit unusual. He chose to forego doing a full clear himself, then try to gank mid. The reason he wanted to do this was because he wanted to cross map and make sure he avoided Spica so he could guarantee getting at least one of the early scuttlebugs, because he's just apparently terrified of running into Spica in the jungle and wants to avoid him at all costs. To do this though, he has to leave up a number of his camps, which Spica also gets vision of him when he goes mid lane for a gank, and is then able to invade and steal one of the camps he left up and get a pretty early advantage in the jungle, just in terms of gold that he's gotten from doing nothing but farming jungle creeps. Game 3, we saw pretty much the exact same thing, this time on Olaf versus Trundle, where again Broxah goes for this kind of weird clear, doing 4 camps and then ganking mid, and again trying to just cross map to make sure he can get an uncontested crab. Bjergsen makes a pretty big mistake here in not realizing that the exact same thing that happened last game is happening this game as well, and he ends up blowing his flash here again. Spica is trying to take advantage of this at first, and he's able to, getting a pretty significant CS lead against Broxah, but Broxah comes back and reganks mid to get a kill for himself, and is finally able to keep up in gold and experience with Spica. Some people thought that Broxah won the jungle in this game because he was able to get a few successful ganks off, but that's not really the case. I mean, if TSM's laners just kind of played lane a little more appropriately, paying attention to where he was, he would have been dead in the water for the 3rd straight game, getting out jungled by this NA rookie. For those of you who watched this series unfold live, I'm sure you remember what happened in games 4 and 5. Spica broke out Jungle Shen, which should not have worked nearly as well as it did. Jungle Shen isn't too far off from being a straight up off meta pick, since you're at a pretty big disadvantage compared to lane Shen. Shen normally wants to always use his Q when it will pass through an enemy champion, because that gives you an attack speed buff on your next 3 auto attacks, and you can't really do that in the jungle. You're given a really slow clear because you only have single target damage anyway, and there's no chance of you ever using that attack speed buff. And yet, Spica somehow managed to keep up in CS with Broxah on Shen, even though Broxah was playing 2 power farming junglers in those next 2 games. Keep in mind, again, this is the first year that Spica has ever even played in LCS, and he is already out jungling the imports that NA teams believe are so much more valuable than he is. When it comes to how far TSM will go at Worlds this year, I mean, they still might have a disappointing finish. I wouldn't be surprised if they get knocked out in groups. But no matter what happens, it's going to be really interesting to see how Spica jungles up against international competition, which should do nothing but help him develop as the next superstar jungler in North America. The other NA rookie worth paying attention to that we mentioned before is Tactical, who has a pretty interesting story of his own. When Team Liquid was having issues with Doublelift earlier on in the year, the team ultimately decided to trade the AD carry back to TSM, which left a pretty big hole in their roster that they chose to fill with their Academy star, Tactical. He obviously had incredibly huge shoes to fill and was thrown into the fire head first, but in spite of the difficult situation he was put in, he was able to play incredibly well for Team Liquid, led them to a first place regular season finish, and won Rookie of the Split. Tactical was a great reminder of the talent that exists in the lower leagues in North America that teams should be taking advantage of way more often than they are right now, but he also showed why some teams may be a bit hesitant to bring that talent up to the LCS too early. Namely, he did struggle a bit under pressure in the playoffs. There was one egregious death in particular in Team Liquid's match against TSM, where he seemingly wasn't prepared for a level 3 power spike, where he ended up having to blow his flash and still died 2 versus 2, giving up first blood in game 1. Throughout the rest of the series, Tactical did start to play a bit more like his old self again, but you could occasionally see some mistakes, just some iffy positioning timing here, or maybe an inefficient use of his ultimate there. Other small issues that I'm honestly willing to chalk up to a rookie playing in his first high-pressure Super Serious playoff series. As with any young talent though, Tactical should do nothing but improve with the exposure he'll get on the international stage. I'm particularly curious to see if he'll be able to learn from his playoff experience and maybe have a bit more clean gameplay at Worlds this year. Either way though, both he and Spica are definitely stars to watch for and should come back even stronger for the 2021 season. Moving on from NA though, let's go ahead and talk a bit about EU. Europe has put up some insane performances after all in the past two World Championships, with Fnatic and G2 each reaching a grand finals. With them representing Europe's number 1 and 2 seeds again, I'm sure many people are watching them above all to see if they can repeat their success of old. But sadly, I don't think they will. Both of these two teams have a pretty clear and relatively easy path to get out of group stage, but their shaky play throughout the 2020 LEC splits just kind of leaves me with a nervous feeling in my gut that this won't be the year EU wins it all. I mean, this is a really competitive Worlds with a ton of teams who have a shot at winning it, so it's going to be incredibly tough for G2 or Fnatic to make a run in bracket. Although that being said, G2, I love you guys. I mean, I made an entire documentary on your history because I love your story so much. Please feel free to prove me wrong. Anyway though, the other two European teams going to Worlds this year, they have a much harder path to get out of group stage, but I honestly think that those newer teams are almost the ones you should be watching more so than the established stars. Mad will be interesting to watch for the same sort of reasons I mentioned about Tactical and Spica. They're going to be developing and gaining a ton of experience. This is a team that's made up almost entirely of rookies who made their LEC debuts this year. Only their mid laner Humanoid remains from when the team was previously Splice. Everyone else all came through the EU Masters scene or other minor leagues, and Mad was able to destroy the LEC during the regular season of the summer split, nearly finishing first place with all of these new fresh faces. They only had a tiny little skid at the very end that knocked them down to second during the final 2 weeks, and then a bit of a rough playoff performance that got them fourth overall. But small disappointments aside, this team performed incredibly well the vast majority of 2020, and multiple players as well as staff ended up winning awards by season's end. If you believe in that play-in buff superstition from 2018, that the added experience of G2 and C9 having to go through play-ins contributed to their successful runs afterwards, then honestly, there's a big reason to think that Mad Lions could make a similar sort of deep tournament run this year. The group they'll be seeded into if they make it out of play-ins is not the easiest in the world, but if they get better and better as the tournament goes on, then they have a real shot of taking games off of DRX and maybe even Top Esports, possibly sneaking out of Group D as the number 2 seed. At the very least, whatever happens, they'll definitely be able to take away an incredibly valuable experience of getting some international competition for their rookie players and hopefully use it to improve their play in the upcoming years. The same could be said for EU's number 3 seed going into Worlds, Rogue, who I'm watching for similar reasons to Mad Lions, although one additional very specific reason, namely Boris. So if you haven't kept up with the memes, there's this current joke that's going on in League's competitive scene right now that players keep on losing to Boris, the shopkeeper. Like, even though these are pro players that are the best in their regions and they have these huge contracts where they get paid to play League of Legends professionally, a ton of them keep on falling into traps of building champions just wrong. Why? Well, they must be getting scammed by the shopkeeper, Boris, who's such a great salesman they can't help themselves. A great example of this is how pro players are sometimes caught building Shen. Shen is a champion who should always be built one way, and pretty much one way only when it comes to top lane. You need to always rush Titanic Hydra first item. That's because this item gives you tons of wave clear that Shen desperately needs, as he only has a single damaging ability, and that ability is also single target. Titanic also gives you a really nice little combo where you can do an auto attack with Q and then immediately reset the auto with the Titanic Hydra that deals quite a bit of damage. This, plus you get a little bit of tankiness in the health that it provides, makes this an item you always need to rush on Shen. But then beyond that, the second item you build should almost always be Randuin's, and then the third item should be Adaptive Helm. You can adjust the order of these a little bit depending on what kind of damage you're laning against, but the important thing is Randuin's is the big armor item you always want to rush. Sunfire Cape is an item you should almost never build. This is a noob trap item that Boris will try to sell you, but Randuin's is better in every possible way. Randuin's gives you more armor and only 25 less health for a very marginal cost difference. It also gives you incredibly useful passives in crit reduction and slowing basic attack speeds of anyone hitting you, which you can force people to do, by the way, by using your taunt. Sunfire, by comparison, only has a little bit of AoE damage that it gives you, which Shen players, they used to build this item for wave clear back in the day in previous seasons, especially with pre-rework Shen, because you really needed a bit of wave clear to push waves faster, but you don't need wave clear with Titanic Hydra. And to top it all off, the slow that Randuin's gives you, that actually is going to give you a few opportunities to hit your Q more often, as well as just auto-attack your opponent, which in turn, that's going to give you more damage than whatever you would have gotten from Sunfire Cape. Sunfire is just a noob trap item, don't get scammed by Boris. Yet, if you go and look and see what it is that pro players build on Shen in their solo queue games, a surprising number of them fall for this trap item and build Sunfire. And if you go and look and see what they build in competitive games, it's almost depressing how frequently they get caught making this very basic mistake. Getting back to Rogue though, the thing that really got this team on my radar is their top laner Finn, who played Shen once in 2020. There was only a single game in competitive play that he chose to play Shen, and it was in the 2020 playoff series, the summer playoffs of LEC, so he is relatively inexperienced with the character, only breaking it out once. But in that game, he not only played fantastically well, but he made 0 Boris mistakes and got the win. Look at that. How beautiful is that? Titanic into boots, into Randuin's, into adaptive. I suspect the reason he was able to build Shen correctly, even though being relatively inexperienced with the character, was because he did his research. In particular, there are 2 EU Challenger one-trick Shen players that play on EU West, Expetu and Shending Help. I would wager a guess that Finn either reached out to these players directly and asked for advice, or he just learned online from these guys what it is you're supposed to build when playing Shen. This allowed him to avoid a Boris scam and helped him to get a win in LEC playoffs. So I can only imagine that if this is the kind of research and dedication that Rogue's players and staff put into champions that they play literally once all year, they must really know what they're doing with the strategies and tactics they do practice frequently. I realize I'm making a pretty big assumption about this team off of a single build that one of their players went for in one game. I also realize that Finn has been a bit of a liability to his team in the past, to put things mildly, and Finn is going to be going up against arguably 2 of the best top laners in the world when Rogue versus JD Gaming and Damwon. Rogue, honestly, were just kind of unlucky to get drawn into the group of death this year, which could very easily lead to them getting an early exit from Worlds. But all I'm trying to say is don't count them out yet, because this kind of work ethic and dedication that Rogue and their players have shown, that's the kind of thing that contributes to success in the world of professional sports. And as unlikely as an upset might be, Rogue could, at the very least, make things competitive. And if there is going to be a major upset at this event, I wouldn't be surprised if they were on the winning side of it. Moving on from the West, let's go ahead and talk a bit about some of the Eastern teams from China and Korea who not only have interesting stories to follow, but also a more realistic shot of maybe finding their way to winning Worlds. China is sending a kind of interesting mix of teams to Worlds this year, where 2 teams are heavy favorites to win it all, and the other 2 not so much, but I almost prefer the narratives of those smaller 2 teams who are none other than LGD and Suning. LGD is basically the Afrika Freaks of this World Championship. This is a team that doesn't have a very meaningful past to speak of, and they've never really won anything before, but they made it to Worlds, and this could be their first real tournament victory, which if they pulled that off, that would be a World Championship. It will be real hard for them to achieve that, as they're coming off some pretty poor placings as of late. They got 11th in LPL 2019 spring, 14th in the following summer, 15th in the following spring, and only made it to Worlds this year after getting 6th in the 2020 regular season with a kind of nice playoff run to make it to Worlds. They do have some really interesting interesting characters on this roster, though, who were able to take down IG in the regional finals that qualified them for this event in the first place. The name you're most likely to have heard of before is Peanut, the Korean jungler who was formerly of the ROX Tigers, SK Telecom, the Longzhou Kingzone team, and then Gen G. After his stints in the LCK, he went off to China to join this LGD team, and honestly, I would really love to see him win Worlds. I mean, he's someone who's gone around to a lot of really talented teams, but he was always on their rosters when they were in their more disappointing years internationally speaking. He's not a world champion himself, even though he was on tons of teams that had the talent to pull that off. He does have some kind of hit or miss play himself, but it would really just be a great comeback story if he could make a run with LGD. The team is also rostering Kramer right now, the former Korean ADC of Afreeca, who helped that team to the quarterfinals of 2018's World Championship, and before that, he played with the legendary organization CJ Entus during their final years. Honestly, I really love Kramer. I mean, even though he's not one of the best AD carries that Korea has ever produced, he still has a really great skill set as a player, and for someone who's never won a major event in his entire career, he is incredibly talented and could very easily help this LGD team to potentially make a run. The other team who qualified from China that's a bit more of an up-and-coming organization who's not a heavy favorite to win Worlds here is Suning, who currently holds the region's number 3 seed. Suning came out of nowhere this summer with a few incredibly impressive and exciting rookies that were paired up with a few interesting veteran imports. Their native players were almost all in their first LPL split this summer, with their top lane being an Aurelia star, who's only 17 years old right now and who was brought up from Suning's academy team. Along with their native players, though, this team has 2 imports, the first of which is Sword Art, who you might recognize as the legendary support from Flash Wolves, a dominant LMS team that crushed the region of Taiwan for years and even showed up very big at a few international events. Along with him, the team brought in Sophim, who's a Vietnamese jungler that kind of has his own storyline going. He'll be fun to follow since, if you're unaware, Vietnam is currently enforcing a really intense restriction for people leaving and entering the country due to the current ongoing plague. This has resulted with the 2 representatives from Vietnam being excluded from this year's World Championship, as they sadly won't be able to travel to Shanghai. To my knowledge, this is the first time an entire region has been kind of banished, I guess, from an international event in League of Legends, and it's really disappointing to see, and I'm sure incredibly sad for all the Vietnamese fans, but Sophim is still there. He can still represent the region himself, and although he's playing with the weight of an entire nation on his back, he will hopefully play very well, and he's on a great team who really could make some craziness happen and potentially make a very deep run in bracket. Last but not least, let's go ahead and wrap this video up by talking about some of the favorites who are most likely to win Worlds this year, namely the 3 heavy favorites, JD Gaming, Top Esports, and Damwon. The first 2 of those teams are the final Chinese representatives that I personally believe there's hardly anything separating these 2 teams in terms of skill. Top Esports has China's number 1 seed as they beat JD Gaming in the LPL Summer Finals in a narrow 3-2 set. But JD Gaming beat Top Esports to win the LPL Spring Playoffs in that finals with another narrow 3-2 set, so who knows, there's no clear-cut winner here that we can be sure of as the ultimate favorites to win Worlds. Each one of these teams has their own interesting storylines worth following with their respective rosters. Top Esports, they kind of have the super impressive roster that a lot of people are looking at with some really fun players to watch. Former world champion JackeyLove is the team's main AD carry, who plays with essentially 2 different supports. Yu Yinjia has been the team's main support for the entirety of the summer split, including Top's great playoff run, but the team also has Chocho on the roster, who is a former AD carry main from Top's earlier days. He's been trying to convert to becoming a support player and played for most of Top's spring split, doing pretty well in the support role, but what I really like about him is Chocho just means balls in Chinese, so he's kind of like the big Fat Gigi of China. The big star of this team, though, that everyone's looking at is their mid laner Knight, who before this event was dubbed the best player to never make Worlds. Knight still achieved plenty of great things in the past, including reaching rank 1 on Korea's solo queue ladder for months on end, as well as numerous top 4 finishes in the LPL, but his lack of a presence at international events has been seen as a big disappointment by the broader community, so a lot of people are really excited to see how he shapes up, because some people are ready to crown him the current best mid laner in the world. Interestingly enough, he also plays League with his right hand using the keyboard and his left hand using the mouse. A little bit weird, but hey, it clearly works for him. Rounding out top esports, they also have a very legendary and well-known Flash Wolves veteran in Karsa, who's the team's jungler, and a pretty fun top laner in 369, who is known for being an incredibly entertaining top, if nothing else. He most recently counterpicked Renekton with Quinn top lane in the LPL playoffs and destroyed Suning with it, so that kind of shows the kind of top laner that he is. JD Gaming, on the other hand, have slightly different storylines with their players. Most notably, you may be aware of their Korean jungler Kanavi. Kanavi was the player that was allegedly tricked into signing a borderline abusive contract with Griffin, who then loaned him out to JD Gaming as a trainee. The whole Griffin scandal that happened back at the start of this year got so heated, a Korean senator commented on Kanavi's situation. Eventually, he was released from his contract, but afterwards would sign a new deal with JD Gaming, and when all was said and done, he's been starting as their jungler ever since. He's honestly been a fantastic player throughout 2020 for JDG and ended up winning MVP for the spring split, as well as first team All-Pro for both spring and summer. Their support player LV Mao also made first team All-Pro this summer. I mean, there's a lot of talent on JDG as well, but the player I'm really curious about watching is Zoom, JD's top laner. Zoom is what you might classify as a quote-unquote weak side top lane, as he's been put on a lot of Ornn. He plays a lot of tanks or a lot of weaker early game champions like Gangplank that are a bit more passive and scaling oriented, that kind of stuff. But that being said, he is one of, if not the best top laner in the world. His play isn't super flashy, because you can't be super flashy on Ornn, but he is an incredibly good top laner who knows his stuff and really might be the best that there is right now. I'm really excited to see him go up against some of the other world-class top laners that we'll be seeing at the main event. But as much as everyone's looking to China to win their 3rd straight world championship, I can't help but think that this is going to be Korea's year to take the trophy back, and for my money, I'm betting Damwon Gaming end 2020 as world champions. If you've been following LCK at all, you know how good this team is. They finish games faster than anyone else while averaging more kills per minute than anyone else. That doesn't obviously equal a good team, but for all the talk of Korea playing a slower paced and more methodical League of Legends compared to the rest of the world, that cannot be applied to Damwon. They are a fast and fun team. When it comes to the individual players to look for on this team, everybody already knows about some of their solo lane superstars, Showmaker, their great mid laner, and Nuguri, their top. But these players, as much as they are absolute stars who deserve all the hype coming for them, I'm gonna say pay attention to Ghost, their ADC. This guy has had one of the most improbable careers in the history of League. His early days were spent on CJ Entus, back when he was playing as a rookie along the likes of BDD and splitting time with the aforementioned Kramer. He then signed with BBQ Olivers and spent about 2 years with that team, who was constantly finishing bottom of the table in LCK and struggled to even stay in the top league. He was really kind of stuck in this sort of Jin Air hell that you see some of the great players in LCK stuck on, but a lot of people didn't expect him to turn into a star or anything. However, he was then picked up by Sandbox, who is definitely a step up, as they were able to finish top 4 in both 2019 spring and summer LCK splits, but still managed to miss out on Worlds and didn't end up winning a title. However, after all of that, and after all those years of grinding, Ghost finally made it onto Damwon, who managed to win the LCK this summer, and in my eyes, they look like the best team going into Worlds. Ghost isn't just a great story though, he also has some really fun gameplay to watch on AD carry. I mean, he can play the boring stuff like Ashe and Caitlyn that you might expect in this meta, but he also breaks out really fun technical champions like Kalista, which is a little bit more fun, but even stuff like Draven, he recently picked as a counter pick in LCK playoffs, and he manages to win with all of this. I mean, he's a really fun ADC, and I really hope he has a great Worlds performance. This video is getting long enough as it is, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up here, but I am very excited for this year's World Championship. This is going to be a great Worlds. I've only skimmed the surface of a few of the stories you're going to see that are worth paying attention to. There are a ton more with a ton more great teams worth looking up great stuff about, and I really expect this to be a great Worlds. I think it's going to be incredibly competitive, and we do not have a clear-cut winner for who's going to take the title, but beyond that, there's just so many great players here at this Worlds, and so many great storylines worth watching that I hope you guys all tune in, and I just can't wait for all of it to begin. Anyway, I'll see you guys in our next video, but until then, thank you very much for watching, good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.